I'm still in Matthew, of course, just picking up where we were last time I spoke. In Matthew section 4, as I call it, the section that is devoted to this sort of contrasting idea that Jesus has disciples who believe the signs while the opposition becomes more stubborn. Of course, in chapter 13, the only sign we've really encountered has been the sign of his parables, but that does count. But so that's kind of the main thrust of the fourth section. And again, we're in chapter 13, which is the parable section, the parables of the kingdom for disciples of the kingdom, which really, I think, sums up the main gist of all these parables that are being told. And we have come all the way through the chapter to the second to last parable, which is the parable of the net. So we're almost through all these. It seems like we've been in them for a very long time. But we're in the second to last one, which we'll go ahead and read. This is chapter 13, verses 47 through 50. It says, "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the close of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Now, the true difficulty of this parable, as I found it to be after I started studying it, the true difficulty of this parable is determining why it was ever told. Why is it even here? Because in many ways, when you begin to think about it, the parable of the net seems like a repeat of the parable of the weeds, which we had earlier in the chapter, which, although being much longer, is actually very, very similar to the parable of the net in many ways. First of all, if you think about that parable earlier in the chapter, both parables contrast the righteous and the wicked. The other one uses wheat and weeds to do that, and the imagery of a harvest, but still there is a contrast between the righteous and the wicked. Both parables portray the end of the age and the final judgment. That's the whole meaning of the harvest imagery in the parable of the weeds, and here at the end we have the final judgment as well in the parable of the net. Also, both parables describe angels as the agents of judgment, which is a kind of detailed aspect of it, but they both include the angels in some reference in both parables. And then both parables describe hell as a fiery furnace where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth, using the same exact phrase, not really being original in any sense. And then finally, both parables are given an interpretation by Jesus himself. So 2 of the 3 parables actually that Jesus himself interprets for us. A lot of similarities between the parable of the weeds and the parable of the net. So when you observe those similarities, you begin to wonder, why did Jesus bother to tell this parable? He doesn't seem to be breaking much new ground as he does this. And furthermore, the follow-up question, why did Matthew bother to record the parable? Because again, in his sifting process, he doesn't record all of them. He didn't have to record this one, and yet for some reason he does, even though it's very repetitious. So the answer to that question as to why we even have this parable from Jesus and from Matthew, the answer to that question comes, I think, when you stop looking at the similarities and start looking at the differences. Because there are differences between them, and largely as I was studying this parable, my study became very much focused on assessing those differences and focusing on them and seeing what came out of it. So that's basically what I was doing as I was studying this, and most of my message is going to follow that general thrust. Now, I decided to call this message Caught by the Kingdom of God. Caught as in, someone ensnares you or gets you. Caught by the Kingdom of God is the title. And the main idea of this parable is that the kingdom of heaven will be especially harsh to the wicked. That's my main statement. The kingdom of heaven will be especially harsh to the wicked. And I want to approach that in 3 different points, which will just gradually step things up, I guess, in intensity as we go through it. First point is that the kingdom will capture the whole earth. So there's not going to be any aspect of the world that's going to be left untouched by the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom's going to take over all of it. Secondly, the kingdom will disregard human fears and human joys. This is the ultra God-centered point of the message, really it is. And then thirdly, the last point, the kingdom of God will display God's revulsion toward the wicked. And I chose the word revulsion because it's the only word that really came to mind fairly after I started to really study the parable. So in those 3 points, we're going to be coming at this idea that the kingdom of heaven will be especially harsh to the wicked. Now, I consider this parable the most sobering of all the parables in the chapter. After all these parables in chapter 13, this one is the most tense, the least rosy of all of them. When you look at a lot of these parables, they focus on some truths that you might be more inclined to consider glorious. The glories of the kingdom of heaven, how it will spread, the lordship of Jesus, just various things like that, just very powerful, very glorious truth. Well, we get to this parable, and all that seems to kind of go away, and you get this very, very sobering image of this net and what it means. So when glorious truth, like the prior parables, will not awaken men to the need of repentance, that is when you turn to more frightening truth and more sobering truth, and that is what I think Jesus is doing here. That, I think, is the role of the parable. As I understand it, coming close to the end of this sermon, we've got to give something that gives one last final oomph, so to speak, to this whole sermon. And that's the role of the parable of the net, I think. So to begin showing you why I think that and where I get all this, first point is that the kingdom will capture the entire earth, the whole earth. Now, to start off this, I want to talk about the size of the net being given as the chief image here in this parable, the size of it, which might be a strange place to begin because Jesus doesn't really elaborate on the size per se, but there is something here you need to see. Now, you go back to fishing back in those days, you're primarily using nets, especially in the industrial, commercial type fishing where you're actually trying to make money to feed your family. You're using these nets. Now, most fishermen use these kind of small hand-thrown nets. They just kind of go out there, whether near the shore or in a boat, and they just have this one big net that they can throw themselves, and they just throw it out there and, catching as much fish as you can with something like that. That's what most fishermen would use. But this word here, used in the parable of the net, does not refer to those small hand-thrown nets. We're not talking about the mini nets that a lot of people would use. The Greek word used here actually refers to a potentially very, very large net, or maybe gigantic would be a better word depending upon your expectations for how big a fishing net can get. These kinds of nets referred to by this word here, they could be as high as 25 feet, when you stretch them out in terms of height. So 25 feet, like a 2-story house. They're that tall. Also, these kinds of nets, they could be as long, potentially, as about 1,000 feet. So a very, very long net, that'd be about the distance between that subway out there and that hotel that's down the road a little ways. That's about 1,000 feet. So imagine a net that tall and that long. That's the kind of net being referred to by this word used in the Greek text of this parable. Now, as you can imagine, those kinds of nets were not used and owned by the mom and pop kind of fishing businesses, not the small family, so-and-so and sons. I can't think of a name right now, Jewish name to be realistic, but not those kinds of fishing businesses. These were used by the larger operations. These were nets so large, the only way to use them would be to have 2 boats out there and one end of the nets on each boat, and the boats are just pulling it through the sea. The other way to do it, actually, they would have groups of men on the shore actually pulling this net in after some boat went out there and dropped it off. They would just stand on the shore and just pull this thing in, whole groups of people. So you got to have a larger company to do this. So in either case, though, you have to drag this net, okay? It's big enough, you've got to pull this thing, whether with boats or whole groups of men. And that's why if you're using the NASB, it says drag net. This is the parable of the drag net in the NASB. Well, they're trying to use that word to show you what kind of net is being used in this parable. Now that should give you an idea of the size of the net being used. And I bring that up because when you understand that, you realize that the kingdom of heaven is not a small venture, right? This isn't like the small hand-thrown nets that just some mom and pop business can use. This is a major operation. These are people who are out there to catch fish, as many fish as possible, and make as much money doing it. And the kingdom of heaven is like that in terms of trying to go as big as possible. Go big or go home. That's the kind of net being used here. It's a very, very large net, potentially gigantic. Now, keeping that in mind, push this a little further. Imagine one of those nets, like I just described, spanning all the way from Subway to the Best Western down there, as high as a 2-story house. Imagine that kind of net being full of fish, because that's what the parable says. You go in here in verse 48, it says, when it was full, men drew it ashore. So that kind of net being described here, being full of fish. Imagine a 1,000-foot net completely filled to the brim, or whatever the edge of a net is called, with fish. Now, we do have two stories in the four Gospels about these large catches of fish, and I do want to read them. In both cases, they're maybe not as helpful because they actually do refer to those smaller hand-thrown nets. I mean, that's the word being used in those passages. So not exactly the same thing, but reading these passages, I think, will reinforce to you the idea of what a full net of fish can be like, even with a smaller net. So let's read one of them in Luke 5. We won't be there long, so you could turn there or not. Doesn't really matter, I don't think. Luke 5, starting in verse 4. This is the miraculous catch of fish when Jesus is with Peter and some of the other disciples. Luke 5, verse 4. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word I will let down the nets." And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. So quite a great many fish captured from one of those smaller nets. Same kind of thing at the end of John's Gospel, John 21, another miraculous catch of fish at the end of Jesus' ministry. John 21, verse 4. Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, do you have any fish?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. So there is so much fish, you can't even move this net now. I mean, you can't even haul it back up. Now, even when dealing then with these smaller nets, a full net of fish is a staggering amount. Even with a smaller hand-thrown kind of net, if you get that net full of fish, you have a lot of fish. Your net's going to start breaking, or you're not going to be able to pull it back out again. That's a lot of fish. Now imagine what it would be like to manage a 1,000-foot drag net full of fish. Imagine those big, long nets completely full. I'm sure, catching that many fish probably never happened, just because it just doesn't seem possible to me. But imagine one of those nets full of fish, and that is the image Jesus gives you for the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is like a drag net full of fish, which would mean that God is in the business of catching as many people as he possibly can. He's going to fill his net with people as part of the kingdom of heaven. That's the item on the agenda. Catch as many people as possible. And of course the question arises, how many people can an all-powerful God catch? I mean, if all the people in the world try to evade being caught, it's not going to work because God's going to catch as many as he can, which his power isn't limited, so he's just going to catch everyone. And that's where we come to this last aspect of this, with this image of the kingdom, that Jesus implies that God will catch the whole earth. The whole world is going to end up in God's net. I have a fun fact for you. And the fun fact is this, that in this parable, the actual word fish does not appear anywhere in the Greek text. Strange to say, we have this parable about catching something, and there are boats, or there's a sea at least, and there's people pulling them in. There's you have that kind of image, but the word fish doesn't actually appear. You go to the Greek text, there is no word fish. We add that for translation's sake, and it's a fair thing to add because, again, you have this image of the sea and nets and men pulling them in. What else could it possibly be? It's fish. They're catching fish. But you look at the Greek text, that word isn't there. Which, again, raises a question when you start to think about it. Why leave out such a natural word? I mean, you could consider it the operative word, maybe next to net, as being one of the key ideas of this parable, and yet the word fish is not there. So why would you do that? Why would you leave out that word? Well, to answer that, I want to have a closer look at what Jesus actually did say, or at least as we have him translated by Matthew here in the Greek text. What he actually does say is something like this in the first sentence. It reads something like this: "The kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered every kind." And that's the phrase used there at the end, every kind. Not every kind of fish, but just every kind. That's the actual wording of the Greek text. Now, that is kind of interesting because that word for kind represents an interesting word choice. Because that word for kind is most commonly used in Greek to speak of the different classifications, nationalities, and languages of humankind. That is to say, people, mankind. That is the word there for kind is used primarily to refer to races and ancestries and generations, but with reference to men, humanity. That is the overwhelming use, especially in the New Testament. In the New Testament, it was pretty much always that way. That is the standard use of that word. So this is a fascinating bit of word trickery when you think about it. You hear one thing and you compute another, but then when you start to think about it, you get more detail there. You have this parable, and even when reading the Greek text, you automatically fill in the word fish just based on the image being presented to you. But when you look at the phrase being used and you really start to think about the wording, you start thinking about humanity. You start thinking about mankind. So it's kind of a trickery here being employed upon you as you read this parable. So Jesus, by the wording he uses, implies that God is going to catch the whole earth, because God is going to catch, quote, every kind. And that word usually referring to humanity. It's sort of like a double meaning. He portrays the kingdom of God as kind of a worldwide web, so to speak, where this net comes and encloses everyone. Every kind of human is what you're supposed to hear in your mind as you look at the Greek phrase actually being used. Now, this idea is very basic to the kingdom of heaven. It's kind of a clever way to say it, but the idea is not new. The definition I've been giving you for the kingdom of heaven this whole time is that a single divine king, descended from Abraham through David, will conquer and rule all nations forever under God in a world of abundance, health, and righteousness. That was my assessment of what the Old Testament said the kingdom of God was going to be like. And you have that phrase in there that the kingdom is going to conquer and rule all nations forever. So it's very much worldwide. You look at the Old Testament expectations of the kingdom, you expect it to cover the whole world. And that is what this parable is trying to do in this little roundabout way, using this phrase that actually refers to humanity, even though in the parable you read it as talking about fish. Kind of interesting. But again, the point being that the kingdom is going to capture the whole earth. Everyone ends up in this net. Now, before moving on any further in the message and with that idea, I want to make sure you understand what I'm saying, or what I'm not saying really. This net image, we're not talking about evangelism. Making this very, very clear. You talk about God catching men, and even the phrase fishers of men, very much an evangelistic phrase. That is not the idea here. Because in the parable, both good fish and bad fish are caught in the net, and the bad fish are destroyed. They're not transformed into good fish, they are wiped out. They are obliterated. So that does not sound like salvation to me. We're not talking about evangelism. This is not an evangelistic text. The theme of the parable is not evangelism, but dominion. It's about control. It's about sovereignty. The point of the parable is that the kingdom of heaven will rule the whole earth. Whether you convert or not, you're still going to find yourself under the dominion of God. You're going to wind up in his net, in that view. Whether you approve of it or not, it's going to happen. That's what's going to happen to the whole world under the kingdom of heaven. Now, typically, thinking of that idea, we Christians will usually view this future dominion of God's kingdom as a very joyful thing. So, I tell you that this parable is not about evangelism, but about God's dominion, and you say, well, that's good too. It's a very good thing that God reigns and God will reign. Well, in this parable, I believe that Jesus wants to show you another side of the matter. And that's where we're going to kind of take a turn here and go into something a little more, sobering. Point number 2, the kingdom will disregard human fears and human joys. That's my second point for you. I mentioned that this was going to be the God-centered point of the message, and I mean that. We often talk about being God-centered in our theology as opposed to being man-centered. Well, I came to the conclusion as I was studying this, the parable of the net might be the high point of God-centered theology in the Gospel of Matthew. At least in the Gospel of Matthew that I've seen so far, I think this parable of the net might be the most God-centered passage that I've encountered so far. because it is most certainly not human-centered. And I think you'll see that when we start to break down the details here. Let's begin with this observation. The kingdom of heaven is like a net. And I want you to have that phrase just in your mind. I want you to let it sink in, thinking about the kingdom of heaven being like a net. Once again, I think our familiarity with this image has caused us to miss the point. We're just so used to hearing these parables by Jesus and accepting whatever he says that we don't really think about the implications of what he's saying and what he means. We hear the kingdom of heaven is like a net, and we say, oh yeah, the kingdom of heaven is like a net. Jesus says so. Why would it be otherwise? Well, think for a moment about what a net is. Think about a net as you're actually out there catching fish or whatever. A net is a trap used to ensnare unwilling prey. No one ever finds themselves in a net who wants to be in a net. You don't ever want to be there. You're trying to get away from the net, and this person got you anyway. That's what a net is. It's a kind of trap. Imagine for a moment, just to push this home, that Jesus told other parables beginning with these lines. The kingdom of heaven is like a snare. The kingdom of heaven is like a bear trap, which if a man steps in it will be really, really painful. The kingdom of heaven is like a tripwire. The kingdom of heaven is like a trap door. The kingdom of heaven is like a hidden pit. Those ideas, when you start thinking about those ideas are all very disagreeable. You don't want to get into a bear trap. You don't want to fall into a pit. And yet, they're not really that different to the idea of a net. All of those things are forms of traps used to catch things that don't want to be caught. It's very much this idea of compulsion and surprise. When you compare the kingdom of heaven to a fisherman's net, and you start to think about that, the idea becomes very, very unsettling. This isn't some sort of, happy, pretty truth. This is God coming to catch you. That's what the meaning of this net image is. The kingdom of heaven is like a net. Now, if you want me to unpack that further, I have a very verbose phrase here for you. The kingdom of heaven will be overwhelming, incomprehensible, and terrifying. And that's just what came out as I was writing down things and observations on this parable. So it's the fault of my subconscious, I guess, if that's a little overwhelming. But the kingdom of heaven will be overwhelming, incomprehensible, and terrifying. And to show you this, let's just use your imagination here. Let's put yourself into the parable, okay? And in the parable, you are a fish. Make that clear. You're one of these things being caught. Let's imagine that you are a fish being caught in a net. And although that sounds very hokey and very Sunday school-ish, the idea itself, when you actually start to think about it, is not very heartwarming. So one day you're swimming along without trouble. Here's a fish looking for food or whatever. And then suddenly as you're swimming, you feel something collide with you. You're swimming this way, and then something comes along and something comes and gets you. It collides with you. And before you can figure out actually what's happening, you discover you're being pulled in a certain direction. Now you're trying to swim this way, but you're being pulled this other way, and you don't want to go that way. You're trying to go over here, but something is preventing you from going the way you want. And as you look around you start to see other fish also struggling to change direction, also being unable to do so. So you and all your fellow swimmers are being just rounded up in something. And just when you thought it couldn't be any worse than that, you feel this kind of great upward heave, this upward pulling motion, and then all of a sudden you find yourself floating in the air. Okay, now remember, you're a fish. You spent your whole life in the water. Air would probably have some kind of mythological quality to it. You hear the old-timer fish maybe talk about the time they jumped above the surface, but you've never been up there. You've never stayed up there. The air is something entirely different to you, and now you're just floating in it. You're up there, and before you can think about that too much, you realize something else, that you can't breathe. You're a fish. You live in water. You breathe water. Now you're in the air. Now you can't get anything. You can't survive now. You feel yourself unable to breathe, or whatever a fish would call that sensation of, getting the oxygen they need. So you have all that stuff, and then adding to all that, these giants show up, okay? And these giants show up, and they start grabbing fish and just throwing them around. They throw them in this direction, throw them in that direction, depending on whatever they want. You don't understand what's going on anyway, so you just see these big giants come, throwing these fish around, and then one of them grabs you, and that is probably among your last memories after that point. Because after all, you've been caught by fishermen. Fish do not survive long. in the clutches of a fisherman. That's what it's like to be a fish caught in the net. And that's the imagery Jesus uses to describe the kingdom of heaven. This is what it's like to see the kingdom of God revealed. Let's just translate the analogy. One day all is normal. You're eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, to use the terminology the Bible uses, just business as usual. It's a bright sunny day out. Let's go do something. Well then, before you can prepare yourself, before you can psychologically make yourself ready for what's going to happen, it is Judgment Day. Okay, it is the day of doom. Okay, the whole world, to use biblical imagery, the whole world burns up underneath your feet, and the stars fade away, and you're left kind of hanging in space or whatever is going to be there. And you see these thrones set up, you see people sitting on the thrones, they're all around you, and there you are. And before you can prepare yourself, once again, you're not ready for any of this, before you can get ready, you're forced to deal with things that are completely otherworldly, outside of all of your experience. You're forced to deal with God, angels, demons, spirits, resurrection, heaven, hell, eternity, holiness. None of those things are fully understood by you. You've heard a whisper of those things. And yet now all of a sudden you're in that world. You're in that world being forced to deal with these beings and these places and these concepts that you were never ready for. Everything you did know from the past is gone, and it's not coming back. That's what it's like. And then, to add to everything that's happened to you on this very bad day, your whole life is exposed at the judgment seat. You're there before God and, Christians, to follow biblical imagery, and everyone's just judging you. You spend your whole life not wanting to be judged, and now all these people are judging you, pulling out all your secret shames and your regrets and your guilt, just exposing them all to the light. And then without any say in the matter, you are assigned to fate, and off you go, and your doom is your doom, and there's no appeal, and that's it. That's over. That is Judgment Day. Now in that chain of events, there's no freedom there. There's no liberty. There's only domination. There's people imposing their will upon you, whether you like it or not. On top of that, there's no familiarity. There's nothing common to you. Everything is the unknown. Everything is the mysterious. And you're just surrounded by it. And you have to deal with it now. And there's no stability either. There's nothing steady, nothing constant. Everything is just swift alteration. Everything you knew is gone. Everything that now surrounds you is different, just very much in an instant. That's what it's like. And that's why I say, although it seems a little over the top, that the kingdom of heaven will be overwhelming, incomprehensible, and terrifying. Those are the three words that come to mind as I think about everything I just said. Now, at this point, you might say, oh, Stan, you're going too far. You're just being a little too heavy with your words here, because after all, for the Christian, all will be well. For us, it's all going to be okay. Well, it's funny that you should mention that, because Jesus does not mention that. In fact, it's probably the one thing he doesn't mention in this whole parable. And that takes me to my next point. That the kingdom of heaven will alarm both the righteous and the wicked. And I want to leave that as alarming as it sounds. Both the righteous and the wicked are going to be alarmed by the kingdom of heaven when it is fully revealed. Now, I tell you to look for these surprises in these parables, because these surprises help you to discover the meaning of the parables, right? So all these things that maybe are said that you would not have expected, or that Jesus' original audience would not have expected, maybe would be a better way to put that. Well, in this case, we have a great surprise. No comfort is extended to the righteous in the parable of the net. Within the small world created by this one parable, there is nothing encouraging put forward to the godly. That's just gone. The idea is gone. Now, for comparison, look back to the parable of the weeds, which I said at the very beginning was very similar to this parable. Let's look at verses 41 through 43. This is the end scene of that parable and its interpretation. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. Now, that's how the parable of the weeds end. The righteous get glory. They get to shine like the sun, which is a very encouraging thought. something to keep you going when things are getting rough, which is the way I presented it back then. Well, all of that is absent in the parable of the net. You will not find that idea. Let's reread verses 47 through 50, the whole parable of the net, and just look for any kind of comfort put forth to the righteous. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the close of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, the glory of the Christian is not described. You don't have this, shining like the sun stuff that the parable of the weeds had. That is removed. The glory of the Christian is not described, which is all the more amazing because, as I said, there's a lot of repetition here in this ending and the ending of the parable of the weeds. You have exact phrases reused from one parable to the other. And yet Jesus dropped out that explanation of what the righteous are going to inherit. I mean, that idea of the future glory of the righteous is just not there. Now, at this point you might say, but Stan, the good fish are put into containers, right? I mean, they're separated out from the bad fish. The good fish are put into containers, right? Isn't that a good thing? Well, let me answer you this. What happens to a good fish in the hands of a fisherman? Why do they put them in those containers? They're going to cook them and eat them, or sell them to people that are going to cook them and eat them. I mean, even the image used by Jesus for what's going to happen to you in this parable is not a comforting image. I mean, it's probably more like hell than the other one. I mean, you're going to be cooked and eaten. I mean, that's the imagery used by Jesus in the parable of the net. In all ways, in the parable of the net, the Christian is just another fish tangled up in the kingdom of heaven. We're just in there, right there, along with the wicked, getting caught and ensnared by God. Just there you go. Just happens all of a sudden. We're just another fish in that net, which I find amazing, really, for many reasons. But for one reason, because Matthew so far in these parables has done a pretty good job of contrasting the righteous from the wicked. The righteous are this seed over here, and this seed over here is the wicked. The righteous are the wheat, the wicked are the weeds, and so on and so forth. He's done a pretty good job of making sure you understand the righteous and the wicked are different, and they have different fates. But in this parable, that's gone. I mean, you have a very subtle hint that there's a separation here, but you don't see any description of what happens to the Christian. I mean, you don't really know. In the small world of this parable, you don't know what's going to happen to the Christians by the end of all of this. That is totally dropped. Which is why I say that the kingdom of heaven will alarm both the righteous and the wicked, because you, the righteous, are just another fish caught in the net. You have nothing put forward to soothe you after you find yourself caught in that net. It's just not there. Now, to bring this back to the point I was making, the kingdom will disregard human fears and human joys. So whatever your emotions are, the kingdom of heaven doesn't care. That's the point I'm trying to make here. Someday, God is going to throw his net around the entire world. The whole earth is going to find itself in this net of God that is the kingdom of heaven. And God is not going to stop to ask people how they feel about that. He's not going to care really about their emotional state at the time God throws that net around the world. And he's certainly not going to take a vote or send out a poll or something to figure out what people's opinions are of this net he's about to cast around the world. God's going to do that regardless of human opinion and human emotion on this matter. Now, if you are afraid of the kingdom of heaven, you will find yourself captured by it anyway. Try to get away. If you don't like this idea, tough, you're going to be caught in that net anyway. If you delight in the idea that God will reign forever, if it is your joy that God will be eternally sovereign, it again doesn't matter. God's still going to throw his net around the world anyway, regardless of your approval of it, and you're still going to be crushed by the immensity of everything that is happening around you. That final judgment scene is still going to leave you, shaking on the ground, if there's a ground left. I don't know if there's going to be a ground left. That's what's going to happen. Your opinion, completely irrelevant. The opinion of the righteous, the opinion of the wicked, doesn't matter, completely irrelevant for the kingdom of heaven. The day of judgment is going to be a truly God-centered day. The day when God says, enough, we're doing what I plan to do now. And this is it, judgment. This is a God-centered day. And on that day, the only feelings that are going to matter are going to be God's feelings. Because the kingdom of heaven is going to disregard human fears, human joys, anything else human. This is the day of God, as one biblical author even puts it. I think it's Peter. But it's the day of God. That's what's going to happen. It's a God-centered day. Now, just when you thought this message could not get any more sobering, I have a third point. The real point that I've been trying to make from the very beginning, we're just going to bring it all together right now. The kingdom will display God's revulsion toward the wicked. And when I say revulsion, I mean utter contempt. I mean revolting. God's revulsion toward the wicked. Now, the true aim of this parable, as I understand it, is to focus your attention on the judgment of the wicked. So in particular, I think the focus actually is supposed to be on the people that are judged and condemned in the final judgment. For one thing, that's how the parable ends. That's the final statement made in the parable, what Jesus is describing. And I've told you in the past, look at the ending of a parable, because that's usually where a storyteller makes his point. He tries to throw that toward the end so you get it. Well, in this case, the last few lines of the parable describe primarily the judgment of the wicked. So I think Jesus wants your mind to go there as he's drawing this parable to a close in its interpretation. He wants you to be thinking about the final judgment of the wicked in particular. Now, those lines about judgment receive far more emphasis from the fact that nothing is said about the righteous. As I was just pointing out to you, the righteous are kind of dropped out of the equation. You don't see their future glory. Jesus, in his description of the final judgment in the parable of the net, only talks about the judgment of the wicked. So again, there's even more emphasis from that point. I mean, in all these ways, it seems like the true focus of this parable, where your mind is supposed to go, is specifically the judgment of the wicked. Now, I think everything that I have said so far contributes to that idea. I know it seems like I've been kind of going back and forth between all these different ideas and trying to make the kingdom sound terrifying for everybody, and I have been trying to do that, but I think all of that does contribute to this idea that the focus is on God's action toward the wicked in the final judgment. Now, to show you why I say that, 1 Peter is a passage that I want to quote here. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 17 and 18. Peter has this interesting statement to make. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? So you have this comparison made by Peter where you have the righteous, just scarcely saved, just barely, and then asking the question, if we just barely escape the judgment of God, what's going to happen to these other people who catch the judgment of God full force? What's going to happen to them? Well, as we ponder the parable of the net, I think we get the idea that the righteous truly are scarcely saved. I mean, they're caught up in this big terrifying net, this overwhelming series of events that's going to happen. I mean, it's going to feel very crushing, very immobilizing. And, we're going to make it through okay, we know that, but still, you're going to find yourself in the middle of all this stuff that isn't exactly peaceful. The righteous are scarcely saved. So what about the wicked? If we're going to see this stuff and be scared out of our minds, what are they going to be like? I mean, if we tremble in the judgment, what are they going to be like having no hope outside of Christ? I mean, that's what they're going to encounter. We're going to have, in reality, a kind of padded version of the kingdom slamming into you. They're not going to have the padding. The kingdom's just going to come and get them. And that's the end. That's what's going to happen to them. So if God is so forceful and frightening, even with regard to the righteous, how do you think he will show himself toward the wicked? Well, let's find out. We can go a little further here with the imagery of this parable, this idea of fish, but specifically bad fish. The image of a bad fish conveys God's revulsion toward the wicked. Now, for many people, a fish is revolting enough. I mean, a fish, not exactly a kind of cute, cuddly creature that you want to keep with you. Few people actually want to grab a fish. I mean, think about it that way. I don't know if you've been fishing. The first time you actually have to grab a fish and your dad makes you pick it up to get the hook out, I mean, you have to kind of brace yourself for that and say, okay, got to do this. And you grab this thing and it's slimy, it's cold, it's wriggling around. Like, no one wants to grab a fish. Eventually you get used to it, but it's not a pleasurable sensation. Fish have this kind of revolting air to them. I mean, they're not a clean creature. I mean, you grab this thing and you're just revolted automatically. That's the idea of a fish. Now imagine the idea of a bad fish. I mean, a fish by itself is revolting enough. But this idea of dealing with bad fish, I mean, that's even more disgusting, right? You have a bad fish. Now, Jesus does not accurately specify what he means by a bad fish. He doesn't go into detail about the meaning of that phrase. As I was thinking about it, I decided there are two options for what he might mean by a bad fish, but either one of them is a revolting concept. It's disgusting. You don't even want to think about it. So let's just talk about both ideas. First of all, a bad fish might refer to an inedible fish, a fish that you cannot eat, or a fish that you at least would choose never to eat if all things were normal. For example, imagine a blowfish. You have those fish that kind of puff themselves up, and they have those spikes, and they're poisonous. That is not an edible fish. And you see that thing, and it's like, get that thing off the boat. Maybe you're pulling in the net, a blowfish falls out, you just like kick that thing off the boat. I don't want that. Blowfish are bad fish. That kind of image. It might be that kind of idea where you have this fish that is just utterly worthless, not for human consumption. So get it off my boat. That's your idea. The other possibility is that a bad fish might refer to a ceremonially unclean fish. Again, talking about Jewish law, the law of Moses, they specify all those kinds of animals that are clean and unclean. Well, certain fish were unclean. They give a list of them. These are fish that you are not supposed to touch because they are defiling in the religion taught by the books of Moses, right? So you have these defiling fish. So imagine you're a Jewish fisherman, you're pulling in all these fish, out drops one of these unclean ones. I think an eel is one of them. An eel is an unclean fish. You say, oh, no, I don't want to touch it. Because I have to go through this cleansing ceremony. I don't want to bother. And you just kind of maybe get a stick and just kind of force that thing off the boat. It's a bad fish. However you understand this bad fish, there's something particularly just disconcerting about them, revolting about them, disgusting about them. That's a bad fish. And that is how God views the wicked in this parable. They are the bad fish. Okay, they're the fish that you don't want. On Judgment Day, God is not going to look at these people and see objects of pity. You don't pity a bad fish. You see a bad fish, you just want to get rid of it. Well, when God sees the wicked, the aim is to destroy them. That is how God's going to view them. He's going to view them with all the contempt that someone would behold a bad fish with, okay? It's that kind of disgustingness, that kind of revulsion. The image of a bad fish, I think, specifically conveys God's revulsion toward the wicked. Now, if you have any doubt about that, the idea of the wicked being revolting to God, let's look at some other ideas. Other ideas right here in this parable, proof that God views the wicked with utter and complete revulsion. First of all, the bad fish are thrown away like trash, okay, like garbage. Like the stuff that you throw out because you don't want to smell it anymore or see it anymore. It was like that. Humans, of course, have always invented ways to give value to themselves. Sometimes they have this idea of honor. Sometimes they have this idea of self-esteem, like in modern times. But regardless, humans like to think of themselves as valuable. We don't like thinking of ourselves as being trash, something you would just throw away. Well, in the parable of the net, people become trash. They become garbage. They're thrown out. These bad fish are thrown away. Also in the parable, you see the fiery furnace as the image used for hell. Furnaces are designed to burn as much fuel as possible in order to trap as much heat as possible to consume as much as possible. These are boxes of fire and concentrated heat. That's their design. And that is the image used for hell. That's what God designed. God designed that place for maximum brutality. That is the imagery of a furnace. You think of this furnace, this place you designed to just maximize a consuming force. Well, that's what hell is. And that is where God has destined people. And you're not going to put something there if you think there's some value to it still. You throw anything in a furnace, you're done with it. And you see no value to that anymore. It's gone. Also, in the parable, hell is a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. Weeping, you understand, gnashing is the kind of grinding of your teeth when you're in extreme pain. Well, imagine that kind of world. Imagine a world where sorrow and agony are not just normal, but they are constant. They're always there. And when you're in that world, your experience is always that kind of experience. weeping and gnashing of teeth. God has made such a world and designed such a world, and he plans to put the wicked there. Now, why would you even create such a world unless you were so full of disgust at the people that are going to inhabit it that that world was necessary to receive them? I mean, that's where God's going to put these people. So to humans, just think about it like this. To humans, hell has always seemed like overkill. You start studying hell, you realize how terrible it is and that it goes on forever, and you start to wonder, is this too much? I mean, surely after 1,000 years it'd be over. Surely God's wrath would have a limit. God has never once in his entire existence, eternally, thought of hell as overkill. Not once. He's never once sat there and thought to himself, am I going too far with this? Is this whole idea of justice too much? God's never thought that way. To God, these wicked humans who are going to be destroyed in the judgment, they really are that revolting. They're like bad fish. And God is going to treat them like bad fish in the end. Now, as a kind of final note, while all of this has a very abrasive tone to it, and it certainly does, it's supposed to, while all of this has a very abrasive tone, I think Matthew probably includes this parable as part of his evangelistic motive. You're asking the question, why does Matthew include what he includes? Why does he include this parable? Especially after it's so similar to the parable of the weeds. Well, I think it forwards his evangelistic case. Evangelistically, I think Matthew's exhortation would run like this. When the kingdom of heaven arrives in its fullness, you will already have enough trouble, okay? Even if you're righteous, this whole thing of the kingdom and judgment day is going to be just awful and terrifying for you. You're going to have to go through this. You have to go through it. You have no option. You're totally under compulsion here. It's going to be bad enough on that day. Do not add to yourself another problem by being revolting in the eyes of God, by making God so full of wrath toward you that he is going to treat you like a bad fish and throw you out with the garbage into a fiery furnace. Don't add to your troubles. It would be better to go through a trial and survive than to go through a trial and perish. Better to go through the final judgment and the kingdom of heaven and come out okay on the other end than to go through all of that and just be eternally miserable forever after. That'd be the better course of action. Now, of course, I think Matthew would be appealing to the human instinct for self-preservation, to take care of yourself, to make sure you stay alive and well. Now, as we make choices of eternal significance, I think we should let that choice guide us, right? A lot of people will think, oh, you're trying to scare people into heaven. Well, the Bible tries to scare people into heaven and does so quite often. This is just one passage where that happens. The true significance of this danger, it may not seem near at hand, it may seem like a far-off thing, but it's real. And every time you delay your repentance, you make yourself more likely a candidate to go through the full force of the terrible things described in this parable. The longer you wait, the more likely it's going to happen. Because Jesus, as we know, is going to come back like a thief. You're not going to be ready. You're not going to be able to prepare at the last minute to make your soul ready for this. If he comes and you don't expect it, it's over. You're done. And you're going to kick yourself for your stupidity of not preparing yourself sooner. The choice to serve God is intensely practical, right? It's a matter of self-preservation. All you have to do is ask the question, do I stand a chance at escaping? Can I get away from the kingdom of God? Well, the answer is no, because it's the kingdom of God. You can't get away from God. So that leaves one choice. And as we say in the old expression, if you can't beat them, join them. If God is coming and is going to capture the whole world and sift out the whole world and judge the whole world, the only logical course of action is to make sure you're on the right side of that equation. That's it. That's all you have. In the church today, there's very much this dislike of preaching this way, but it's here, right? It's in the Bible. Jesus does it, and if Jesus does it, Christians should do it also. So I think Matthew does. I think Matthew extends this as part of his evangelistic desire to see his own people converted. If all the glories of these parables so far, if they've understood them, haven't done the job, then maybe this one last image of this very overwhelming kingdom will do the trick. So you have this idea that the wicked people are revolting to God, but I think very much forwarded to this idea of trying to get people to convert and trust Christ. And that, I think, is the main point. So I'm just going to do a summary here. and kind of cover all of this. You have this idea that the kingdom of heaven will be especially harsh to the wicked. And I think my whole message kind of drives that point forward, even if indirectly. First of all, that the kingdom will capture the whole earth. I said that the kingdom of heaven is no small venture. That's when I was talking about the net and just how big it is. I said that God aims to catch men until his net is full, meaning he's going to catch the whole world. That was my third point about the kind of double meaning there of the every kind phrase, that in the end God will capture the whole world and the whole world will be part of his kingdom. And then my second point was that the kingdom will disregard human fears and human joys, disregard human emotion altogether. And I pointed out that the idea of a net is a very ominous one if you're a fish. And of course in the parable, we are the fish. So this whole idea of a net is overwhelming and incomprehensible and terrifying. And that's the image Christ uses for the kingdom of heaven when it comes. So the kingdom is going to be an alarming thing for both the righteous and the wicked. Even if you come out okay on the end, you still have to go through this big scary thing that's coming upon the world. And then finally, all of this is a display ultimately of God's revulsion toward the wicked. That's the main point of the parable. And the true aim, I think, is because of the way Jesus ends the parable and the way he sort of cuts out all the good stuff about the righteous. Also, he has this image of the wicked as bad fish. I said that however you understand the phrase bad fish, it's going to be a very revolting idea. And that's the way God views the wicked, with complete revulsion. And then furthermore, you have these other images in the parable of the fish being thrown away, of the fiery furnace, and the weeping and gnashing of teeth, and just how those things describe God's animosity toward the wicked that he will have in that day. But then, of course, all of this, again, I think evangelistic in motive, trying to get people to turn from this and turn to Christ. All of that from the parable of the net, which again, as I said, very sobering parable, no doubts there, but I think that's the intention. So if there are questions on this or comments, we can hear them.